The most important factor when buying an airplane is buying an airplane that will accomplish at least 80% of your missions. Instead of immediately jumping into what plane looks cool, what paint job do I like, that sort of thing, I think we first need to really assess what mission do I need the airplane to accomplish in the first place. And I think a lot of owners either miss or completely skip this step. Now, mission might sound like a new concept, but it's really familiar once you realize you've already done this analysis when it comes to thinking about what car you drive or where you're going to live. When you're buying a house, you wouldn't just say, I want a modern farmhouse for X dollars. No, you instead start filling in the mission of that house. Now, we might not call it mission, but that's exactly what we're assessing here. We say things like, well, we want at least a 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom, and I want it in this neighborhood so we can have access to these schools. You're really just describing the mission that that house needs to accomplish. And then you might find out that getting a house that accomplishes that mission might not be realistic within the budget that you outline. And so you either have to start tweaking some of the variables within the mission or tweak the budget itself. And I think we can do this exact same process with airplanes. Now, first, I think it's really important to pump the brakes and separate your average mission from your aspirational mission. Where do our daydreams take place? None of it takes place in the average mundane. All of our daydreams take place here. We want to think about what's the aspirational goal. Let's load up all the boys, go to the mountains, go to a resort, and take our golf clubs and all this stuff. I've never done that personally, but I like to think that I want an airplane that can handle all of that. But will that happen maybe 1% of the time if I even had an airplane that could do it in the first place? Most of the time over the last 8 years, I'm actually flying by myself. And that was kind of a surprise to me. I thought way more people would want to fly with me, all my friends and everything. But I fly alone quite a bit.
Cause I'm all alone.
That's not what I meant. And there's sometimes when I really load down the 182, we have family and all the baby stuff that you can possibly fit in there. But most of the time, that's not what my mission looks like. And so I think it's important to think about what kind of mission am I actually going to encounter and need the airplane to accomplish 80% of the time. And I think in order to answer that, I like to think about mission in terms of 6 different things. It's what I call the 6-point mission. First is budget. Now keep in mind that budget isn't just the purchase price, but you need to budget for the ongoing operating costs as well. Lots of people just think about it in terms of the purchase price, but I'll put it this way. I have easily spent the purchase price of my airplane all over again, just owning and operating it over the last 8 years. Now there's a lot more to be said on this topic, but at the end of the video, I'll share another video where I go into a budgeting topic in a lot more detail. And I even share a financial model that you can use. So stick around until the end for that. Next is seats. How many people do you want to be able to carry on average? I think it's really worth pointing out here that just because an airplane has a certain number of seats doesn't necessarily mean it can realistically carry that many people. So if you're planning on routinely carrying 4 people, you might be looking at a 6-seat or larger aircraft. You really have to look at it in the overall context of the useful load, which is the next point. Useful load is basically how much can you carry between fuel, people, and stuff. Now, in my opinion, I think useful load is maybe one of the most limiting factors of an airplane. In my experience, the airplanes I've flown, it's not been that, oh, they can't go far enough or they don't go fast enough. Now, I've run into useful load problems way before I've run into speed or range issues. And so knowing how much you'll be able to carry in the airplane and how much you probably need to carry on an average mission is really, really important. And then I think you also really want to look at useful load in context of fuel required and fuel burn on average. For example, some airplanes, it's not a big deal to start the airplane, start the flight with full fuel on board. Then in other airplanes, you're very rarely going to have full fuel because if you have full fuel, you can't carry like anything on top of that. So you got to look at it in context. So for example, my 182 with full fuel can carry a little over 650 pounds on top of that, which is not bad. But keep in mind that full fuel is also 75 gallons or nearly 6 hours of fuel on board at cruise speed. And so in few instances do I actually need that much fuel. But with about a half tank of fuel, I can carry just under 900 pounds. It's a lot. And still have a couple of hours of fuel on board plus reserves. And then I can still make it hundreds of miles. So I think you definitely want to understand the useful load on paper, but then definitely take a moment to think through the practical application of it. Next is speed. Not how fast do you want to go, but how fast do you realistically need to go? It gets exponentially more expensive to go faster than about 200 knots. And so unless you're needing to go a really long way routinely, the difference in 130 knots versus 120 knots or 150 knots really just doesn't add up to that much of a difference. It's still way faster than driving. I'll put it this way. Whenever I go on some flying trips with my friends that have 172s, I'll be in my 182 that's, I don't know, 20 knots or so faster, maybe a little bit more. And I always think that it's gonna add up to a really big difference. Like, no, you guys should take off first because I'm faster. And it really just doesn't add up to much difference at all. Unless we're going a really long way, it's not an appreciable difference. So take that in consideration. To me, I wouldn't be like, oh, this one's 130 knots, this one's 150. That's so much better. It's X% better. Just at the end of the day, when you really start looking at your average mission, say your average mission is 200 miles, how much faster are you actually gonna get there going another 20 knots faster? So again, don't just look at it on paper. You have to think about what's the practical application. Next is performance and range. And I kind of group these together. Basically, what type of flying are you going to be doing and what kind of performance do you need when you leave or when you arrive? Is it all long paved runways, or do you want to be able to go to the backcountry, have some fun, do some short airstrips? Or will you be flying mostly near sea level, or are you gonna be in the mountains? Do you need a turbocharged airplane to fly up at altitudes and high density altitudes? Think about your average performance needs. Now, unless you're routinely needing to go far and fast, I personally haven't found range to be that much of a limiting issue in my own general aviation flying, but my mission profile could be very different from your mission profile. It's the point of this video. Even if the airplane can go 5 or 6 hours, I usually need a break before the airplane does, and so range hasn't been that big of a deal. The time that it has been a big deal for me, I will say, is if you're gonna be flying around the backcountry or you're flying places where you're not planning on stopping for fuel and you want to have 5 or 6 hours of endurance, even though you're not gonna be doing 5 or 6 hours, 6-hour legs per se, that has been really helpful. But then you also wanna look at it in terms of useful load, of say, okay, even if we wanna carry 5 or 6 hours of fuel on board because we're not planning on stopping for fuel, even though we're planning on stopping, what can we carry on top of that? So it's kind of an interrelated thing, but that's kind of how range has played out for me. Next is equipment. And I think a good starting place for this is whether the airplane needs to be VFR equipped or IFR equipped. And if you want IFR equipped, it's gonna have to have some slightly different instruments in order to qualify for that. And then within that, try to consider what types of instruments you ideally want. Like for me, I knew that I wanted a Garmin GPS, some kind of HSI, and an autopilot. So I was looking for an aircraft that ideally already had that installed, because sometimes it can be cheaper or at least a lot faster to just buy one that already has the stuff in it rather than retrofit it yourself. So start by taking your best guess at your average realistic mission, and then once you do some research on different aircraft models, you'll start to learn whether or not certain parts of your wish list are even realistic or not. You might have to decide which parts of your mission are non-negotiables and which ones you can be flexible on in order to find an airplane that's suitable. So for me, when I was switching from renting to buying, I was renting 172s and I didn't know exactly what my average mission would be, but here was my best guess. My purchase price range was up to 120K. The useful load, ideally, I would have liked to be able to realistically take 4 people and some fuel if needed. So really wanted 1,000+ pounds of useful load, so that way I could actually carry fuel and light bags and some people. Seats, I wanted 4 seats. On speed, this wasn't really a deal breaker for me. Honestly, I was fine with whatever. This was something that could be flexible. On range and performance, I wasn't so concerned about range, since I assumed that if I had a high useful load, I'd also have a reasonable range too, because when I didn't have many people or much stuff on the airplane, I could always just carry a lot of fuel. Now, as for performance, I wanted the ability to go to grass strips and experience the backcountry from time to time. That's my favorite stuff. So reasonable short field capability was definitely on my list. I knew I wasn't just gonna be landing on 7,000-foot paved runways all the time. And as for equipment, I really wanted IFR capable with a Garmin GPS, an HSI, and an autopilot. Ultimately, I selected a Cessna 182. I figured that if this is the only airplane that I ever owned, it would be able to do a little bit of everything, because my mission needed it to be able to do a little bit of everything. I think this is its superpower, that it's not the fastest, it doesn't have the most useful load, it's not a winner in any of these categories that I just presented, but it has a respectable stat in all of those. It's not a Suburban, but it's kind of a Tahoe, to use a car reference. Yeah, are there missions where I kind of wish I had a 206 or I could use more space or useful load? Yeah, but that's a small single-digit percentage of the time. And so the 182 has fit my average mission really, really well, and I highly recommend that airplane. So finding your average mission is a really important step of the airplane buying process, but it's only one step of many. So if you're serious about buying an airplane one day, I highly recommend that you check out the webinar here on the screen. It's totally free, and I cover all of the ins and outs, every step of the airplane buying process in detail. I offer some free resources, financial models, and other things to help get you started. I hope that it can be really helpful to you. So I'll see you in that video.